What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Capes, a gritty superhero TRPG where we take on the role of a bunch of superheroes fighting off supervillains who have previously won control of King City. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video covering everything I go over, and moreover, my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Capes, it's important that I mention that I did in fact get a review copy of this game from the game's publisher, Daedalic Entertainment. And more than that, they actually gave me very early access to the game via its first chapter all the way back in April, despite the game releasing very recently on May 29th. Now, my progress from that first chapter of the game actually carried over to the full release of the review copy that I received, which I mentioned very specifically because the Steam achievements for the game weren't actually added until later. So for the people who like to look at my Steam profile, I do actually have some of the early achievements out of order, as I continued on from the first chapter when I picked up the review copy, which means I had to double back and get some of the early story achievements. Otherwise, though, thanks to the game's ability to replay missions with all of your unlocked progress via heroes and their abilities, 100%ing this game is not a difficult thing to do. But let's talk a little more specifically about it. Now, as I mentioned, a superhero TRPG, where we're going to be controlling a total of 8 different superheroes. Unfortunately, you won't be able to make your own, which is a bit of a shame because it's always a requested feature in games like these, to be sure. But each of these heroes does in fact feel unique with their own powers and abilities, including just simple movement or how their ultimate charges up even. And we're going to be taking these unique heroes across a bunch of different missions, including some things like stealth-oriented missions, and using them to, of course, decimate the enemies of King City, the nefarious company, as it were. But the first thing I like to talk about in pretty much every review I do these days is the technical state of the game. And on my end, at least, all I encountered were fairly minor bugs here and there, and an occasional bit of stuttering, which I believe they've actually already addressed via the game's first patch. Apparently some of the camera transitions with DLSS enabled could cause the issue, but some of the minor bugs I mentioned were mostly little things in combat, such as a story-related cutscene playing twice back-to-back, which didn't really affect you completing the mission or anything, it just made it a little bit awkward. But otherwise, the game ran pretty well for me, and I didn't encounter any issues, and with this game already being released a couple of days, looking through Steam reviews, I can't really see anybody mentioning specifically performance either, so it seems to be in pretty good shape on that front. But let's move on to difficulty. So difficulty for this game, while picked at the very beginning when you click on New Game, it really is more of a per mission difficulty system. You can change the difficulty whenever, and the difficulty itself affects how much health your heroes have, more on lesser difficulties, less on higher difficulties, but also things like how quickly your heroes can use their ultimates in combat, the range at which they can team up with other heroes via their combo abilities, and things like that. Whereas on the higher difficulties, if a hero goes down in combat, you don't have a chance to revive them as the mission just fails. And with each mission being a sort of handcrafted encounter, it's again really more about the missions than it is the overall difficulty for your campaign. Which brings us nicely to the story setup for this one. So as I mentioned, there is no character creation. We will be playing 8 set heroes, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, but what is the goal of what we are doing here? So the game takes place in King City, a bustling metropolis that used to be protected by all sorts of various superheroes that they called Capes. Sometime in the past, many of these Capes were just straight up killed by a company that ultimately won the battle. These became the supervillains of the game, and ever since taking control of the city, they've obviously been ruthlessly managing it, hunting down any lingering superheroes who have effectively had their powers outlawed, so even if they are harmless or even simply unaware that they had powers, once they are discovered, they're captured and taken somewhere. And the company doesn't really much care about who they have to hurt to make this happen, including the regular old civilians, which is where we come in. We start off the game with 2 of our 8 heroes, Facet and Rebound. They are working with a grizzled hero veteran named Doctrine. Doctrine is gathering up the superheroes he can manage to save in order to fight back against the company, which forms the bulk of the story. And broadly speaking, I think it's a pretty decent narrative overall. Now, given that TRPGs aren't exactly known for their super in-depth story, I think this game tries to do a lot with a lot of scenes focusing on the different heroes, what they're good at, their personalities, interactions with each other back at base called the Lodge, and they even managed to throw in a few interesting twists about the nature of their superpowers, where they come from, what that power is, what it does to these people. So there's a few interesting plot points being my point, though the bulk of the game takes on this very gritty tone where the company is sort of bearing down on regular civilians, stomping out any form of resistance, killing anybody who gets in their way, etc. But sometimes that's juxtaposed against bits of awkward tone, I would say. Moments where the game attempts to be a little more, I would say, tongue-in-cheek, which isn't necessarily odd for a superhero genre, but can feel a little out of place at times if I were being critical, which obviously I am. But overall, I thought the story was pretty good for the nature of this type of game. But I think an important thing to mention about the story, and as it relates to the rest of the game, is that it is a bit linear. As this game, gameplay-wise, utilizes a sort of out-of-combat menu where you can take on your next missions. These missions are all handcrafted, nothing is RNG or procedurally generated, etc. Every single encounter you have is a scripted, handcrafted moment, which means the first time you take on a lot of these missions, though they can be replayed through that menu, you're limited to the progression you currently have, including heroes, their abilities, how far you've managed to level them up based on optional objectives, and at times, via your first run through the game, it can sort of feel like you're very limited in terms of your options and how to approach any of these various things. Now, ultimately, this means that as you get towards the end of the game, once you have all the heroes unlocked, start getting their powers beefed up, you can go back and replay a lot of these earlier missions, which you likely will if you're going after the achievements. And at that point, how you can approach those missions is much more wide open, and to me felt much more satisfying as an experience because I had all these options that would have been fun to have as I move through the game. So another slight criticism of the story here is simply that it would have been nicer to have all of the heroes earlier so you could play around with options as you move through the story, which is probably a good place to transition into the progression systems of the game. So right away, progression comes down to, as I've already mentioned, moving through the story, unlocking more and more missions, and thus the heroes themselves, but then there's how we upgrade those heroes. So the heroes who participate in combat, you can have a party of 4 generally, though sometimes less due to specific story reasons. Each of these heroes that participate in combat is going to earn experience from the mission that they can level up with. Only to level 5 though, because each level that you gain, you unlock a bunch of upgrades to their skills and abilities that you can then acquire via skill points. Skill points are acquired via 2 means: completing objectives in combat, for the first time that is, and then completing hero challenges. Each hero has a list of things you can do with that hero, such as using specific team-ups or simply leveling up to their maximum, for instance, which will also grant you skill points that you can then spend on all their upgrades. Now, one thing I really like about that bit of progression, though, is that even heroes who don't initially feel very interesting can be upgraded to a point that they are very, very good. Some of them start out pretty strong, like for instance Weathervane, who has a chain lightning attack that can be utilized to hit a ton of enemies to then power up his big AoE ultimate, so right out of the gate he's pretty strong. But characters like Ignis, who can throw and spread fire around and then absorb it to charge up her ultimate, which sort of deals a proportional amount of damage based on the enemies that are on fire and how much charge she's accumulated, is a little tricky to play until you get some of her upgrades that make her much better. But to their credit, I will say that pretty much every single hero was very compelling to play once you got all of those unlocks and everything going, which is when I was having the most fun with the game myself. And that's pretty much everything there is to know about progression in this particular title, so let's move along to combat and gameplay, which as a TRPG are essentially the same thing, so we'll kind of lump all this together here. Now, as I already mentioned, the game has this mission structure. In between missions, we're working out of a menu, essentially, known as the Lodge, or our home base, that you can navigate to see conversations between individual heroes that you've unlocked by completing challenges, upgrading your heroes, or simply selecting which mission you want to do next. Now, from this mission select screen, you can either choose to take on patrol missions, campaign missions, or simulate a previous mission. Patrol missions will usually have to be completed to at least some degree in order to unlock the next campaign mission, but each mission that you can see here comes with a whole host of optional objectives for extra skill points, one of which is always managing to perform every bonus objective in the same instance of that mission. So if you manage to do all of the optional objectives, you'll get an extra bonus for having done so. Now, the thing I want to call out here specifically is that while some missions, I think it makes sense to have these a little bit based on the heroes that you'll be using. For instance, a couple of missions only have you using one very specific hero, and in those cases, sure, it makes sense that the optional objectives would be tailored to that hero, but sometimes they do this for missions that don't have a hero restriction, which can be just a little bit awkward, frankly. Like, for instance, there's one in which you have to chain lightning a bunch of enemies all at once, which means if you want to do the optional objectives for that mission, you're going to have to take Weathervane along, even though he's not technically required. And we'll talk about the heroes momentarily. But little things like that can give you the illusion that there's a sort of more puzzle tactics vibe here where there's only one solution, but in my experience with the game, that wasn't really true. There's a whole bunch of solutions that they don't do a fantastic job of really highlighting until the end of the game comes around, where you've unlocked all those options, such as all your various heroes, and their upgrades to go alongside those things. So simply put, I wish you came into all of the heroes and their powers a little bit faster, because I think that would have made the initial run through the campaign feel a little better. But it is what it is. But with that said, let's talk a little bit about the heroes you'll be interacting with, and they can all be divided into a few different subtypes, if you will, such as your defensive heroes like Facet or Hyde, who are all about taking damage and absorbing what the enemy can do, strikers who are all about, of course, simply dealing damage and, in some cases, movement, and specialists who are more about controlling the battlefield via movement abilities and positioning, who can usually also do a fair bit of damage. Now that's important to understand because how each of these heroes gathers their ultimate in combat, including simply how they move, is all pretty unique, but there are some generalities. So first up we have Facet, our I would say main tank, who can grow crystals that allow him to be very defensive in nature, but also root enemies in place. He charges up his ultimate by taking damage, which allows him to then root everybody in a giant range in place. But then we have Rebound. One of our early damage dealers, she has the ability to teleport, which means her movement doesn't trigger things like attacks of opportunity. But more specifically, if she can attack enemies from behind, she'll deal even more damage, usually to the tune of like double. And hitting enemies in the back charges her ultimate, which allows her to unleash a devastating guaranteed hits against enemies in an area that can be very useful for taking out small groups of enemies, which is pretty nice. Then we have Mindfire. Our resident psychic, he is capable of dealing tremendous damage at the cost of not being able to move very far. His abilities allow him to mark enemies as vulnerable, which increases the damage they take from everybody, and attacks against those vulnerable enemies charge up his ability, which is another damage dealer, that if used against enemies marked by vulnerable will deal tremendous damage to single targets. He also gets an ability called Focus that allows him to sacrifice his movements for another action. So positioning for this guy is very important, as he can be a bit frail in a sort of glass cannon situation. Then we have Weathervane. One of my favorites to actually play. Weathervane is a specialist who can move enemies around the battlefield with ease via his storm powers, which allows him to pull enemies to him, push them away, or use chain lightning to hit tons of them at once, which when fully upgraded can hit massive amounts of enemies if you set it up properly, which is what charges his ultimate, that is a big AoE storm that will hit every enemy in range once. In particular though, this guy is great for missions where you can throw enemies off the ledge, as he has a lot of abilities that are going to allow him to do just that, which is a not dissimilar situation from Mercurial, our very fast hero, who can also knock enemies back. Being a speedster though, she will gather up her ultimate as she attacks enemies, with her ultimate itself simply giving her more turns. So the more you can hit enemies, the more you'll be able to use her ultimate, which allows her to take more turns, meaning that she can attack very, very often when maxed out. And given her ability to also push enemies around, this can make her very, very effective for rooftop missions where she can just sort of methodically knock every enemy you see off the ledge, making her pretty deadly on top of everything else. Then we have Kinetic. Kinetic is great at single target damage, but also powering up your other heroes, and abilities that simply allow them to use their ultimate really, really often, which is this big AoE burst punch attack that deals relatively low damage, but can push everything back and hit in a range, but charges up so frequently that you can use it pretty often. That, combined with some stuff like attacks of opportunity that they get access to, can make for a pretty situational hero that, while I would say not generally one I like to use, can be absolutely devastating on certain missions, especially in close quarters. Then we have Ignis. Ignis is your fire starter, being able to spread and absorb fire on the battlefield to, of course, set enemies on fire, and then absorbing fire that she either causes or is simply on the ground will give her charges to her ultimate ability that allow her to then put out a big burst of AoE flame that hits all of your enemies that are on fire, with all of the burning damage simply doing damage over time as well. Now, this is a hero that I didn't really enjoy playing until they were leveled up, which enables her to do things like heal, disarm and destroy weapons, and even teleport to flames instead of their normal movement. And last but not least, we then have Hyde. Hyde is another defensive hero that can turn into a Nano Titan, and while not technically a superhero, just a very smart individual, Hyde can be absolutely devastating if used properly. Now, normally, they act as a bit of a support character, being able to summon decoys that enemies will attack, which charges Hyde's ultimate, but also being able to do things like heal or set up revives for your teammates even, but upon charging up their ultimate, he can turn into a Nano Titan. The Nano Titan does fantastic damage, but also provides a second health bar and actions. Hyde could theoretically spend his turn taking his actions, such as setting up decoys, attacking via his basic strike, and then use his ultimate to turn into the Nano Titan, take even more actions, pushing enemies, controlling the battlefield, before ending his turn, and then if the Nano Titan's health bar gets destroyed or the timer runs out, you revert back into Hyde with a fully healed health bar, and typically more actions as well. So Hyde can be devastating if leveled up as well, which is a shame that you don't get him until the very end of the game, basically. Very close to it anyway. So while you can't actually make your own hero, I would say there's a fair few interesting ones, and generally I liked playing around with all of them. But from there, let's actually talk about the missions themselves. So when it comes to the missions, they can be divided up into a few types, and I would say general missions where you have access to a full team like normal, and then more stealth-oriented missions or missions that use a very specific character. In either event, though, we're going to take these characters and, of course, try to clear whatever the mission objectives are. Sometimes that is merely to get to point A to point B, rescue someone, protect a target, or a few other things, alongside all of those optional objectives I already mentioned. But from a very basic standpoint, this is a movement and action point system where each turn our characters will get a set amount of movement that they can take, alongside the ability to perform 2 actions generally, though some heroes have the power to modify that, of course, and then if their ultimate's charged, that can be used independently of everything else. So using your abilities of each hero, which can often be devastating and attack many enemies effectively, while also keeping in mind what enemies do and how you can mitigate that via certain heroes, in combination with one another, forms the bulk of the tactics gameplay here, and in particular, it's a game that I think shines once you get everything unlocked, because that gives you full access to all of your options, which is important because some early missions even are better suited to heroes that you get later on, which means some missions that I struggled with the available heroes at first glance, I came back to later with further unlocked heroes such as Hyde being able to tank in a unique way and use his actions with the Nano Titan. He actually trivialized a couple of the early missions that I really struggled with. But another interesting thing about the combinations of heroes you bring are the team-up abilities. You see, in addition to the basic abilities of each hero, some of them can be augmented by doing them with another hero. So for instance, take somebody like Rebound. If she is nearby, Mindfire can actually give her the ability to turn an enemy around via his psychic ability to guarantee a backstab hit even when she would not normally get one. Or if she does this with Mercurial nearby, it will usually add disarm to it. But what is it we're actually disarming? Well, that is generally weapons. Now, in general, enemies of course come in a few different varieties, each with their own abilities and powers. Later on, you'll be even fighting some powered up enemies who have similar abilities to your own, and learning to manage those is of course part of the tactics. But one thing that is pretty common is that a lot of them need to be disarmed. This is a way to interrupt their charged attacks in some cases, and other times it quite literally means disarming them, like basic enemies will pick up melee weapons or guns even that can attack you at range, and you'll have abilities that will disarm them, which are those blue ticks below their health. This will force them to drop the weapon and obviously reduce incoming damage on you, which is important. So managing disarming enemies, especially in big boss fights, tends to be a very important system mechanic to understand and learn about. In particular, though, I really enjoyed going through the game and learning how all of these heroes interacted with each other, abilities that complemented each other well, what team-ups were available, and learning how to manage all those different combinations, which is why I think the game is so much more satisfying when you get to the end of it and you have all of those options available to you that would have been fun to mess around with throughout the rest of the game when you only had like 4 heroes to choose from anyway, which is a problem that is compounded a little bit by the fact that skill points aren't widely available early in the game either, which means the heroes that you have can only be upgraded so far, which is another reason the game can feel very restrictive in the early hours in terms of how you approach certain missions, which is just a shame because I think the system they built here is a lot of fun, but it takes probably a little too long to get there, frankly. Now, the last thing I want to mention before we move on a little bit are the sort of stealth mechanics. Some missions are purely stealth, some are potentially stealth, that is to say you can complete them stealthily, and then other missions are a bit of a hybrid where you're likely going to start out in stealth, but it will turn into a fight later. To that end, sometimes enemies will be thus unaware of our hero's presence, and they will simply be patrolling around to that effect, which means you have to watch out for things like line of sight and use your hero abilities accordingly. Now, generally, this means that you need to kill any enemy that spots you or is aware of your presence before they have the chance to alert all of the other enemies around. Now, ideally, you'll do this while they are completely unaware of your presence, which is going to give you the ability to deal extra damage to them due to their unaware state. Rebound is the natural pick for this, as her teleportation abilities make her kind of naturally leaning into this with her backstabs and stuff, but later on, via upgrades, this becomes more viable with other characters as well, such as Mindfire. He actually gets his own mission that can be a stealth mission if you'd like to turn it into one, which was kind of fun, and in particular I just appreciated how these missions kind of mixed up the formula a little bit and saw you kind of memorizing patrol routes and strategically taking out enemies at certain times, and there is a little bit of suspension of disbelief here because bodies will just disappear and you don't need to do anything with them. And you can kill an enemy right next to another one as long as he's not looking in your general direction. But for some reason, ultimates will sometimes alert enemies to your presence. So it can be a little bit inconsistent on that front at times, but once you kind of learn the ins and outs of it, it's pretty fun. But that finally brings us to the Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this up. Happy to report that the Steam Deck is now in a pretty good place, which is fantastic because TRPGs usually do very well on that system. But if you played the demo of this game a while back, you might remember that it performed pretty poorly on the Steam Deck at that time. But the developer, Spitfire Interactive, was able to use that feedback to optimize for the Steam Deck, so now it is a verified title. Cloud saves, controller support, the default settings will see you getting around 50 FPS, at least in my experience, which is more than enough for a turn-based title. So overall, runs great on the Steam Deck, not much else to say there. Might very well be a preferred way to play this for many, I imagine. So that brings us to our positives and negatives. Now, the positives for me were the late game tactics. The game, once you get everything unlocked, all your heroes, they're all upgraded, you can do all this crazy stuff with each one, so each one of them is this giant powerhouse, and that unlocks so many more options for how you can approach things, which can do things like simply making getting the optional objectives easier, which allows you to get more skill points to make even further progression, for instance. But it also just made the game feel much more satisfying to me at that point, which is what I enjoyed about it. Now, another positive, though, was the actual hero progression. I think it was really cool to see pretty much every hero go from somewhat limited in their options too, with some upgrades being an absolute powerhouse. Even the ones I didn't like so much at first, like Ignis. Once you learn to play around with those abilities and who else that they pair up really well with, you can learn all those fun combos and things, which goes a little bit back to that late game progression that I mentioned. And I think that's when the game is at its most satisfying. But there are, of course, some negatives, and for me, it's just the initial restricted options. The roughly first half of the game where you don't have access to all the heroes or even their upgrades, which are very limited because you can only complete so many of the optional objectives because you don't have a hero with which that would be easy or the upgrades that would make it easier. And in those moments, it can feel like there might only be like one or two right answers to the situation, as compared to later on pulling off an absolute spectacle of combos and things utilizing individual heroes to do some just really impressive and fun stuff. And I simply wish the game got to that point faster because I think they're going to lose a lot of people in the opening half of the game before it starts to get really good. And all of that brings me to my conclusion. Capes has the potential to be a lot of fun if you power through a bit of a slow early game. And while there are certain other things I would have liked to see, like for instance the ability to make your own hero, given the developer's very small size of I believe only like 4 people, I'm willing to overlook some of that myself. Now, what I think does actually make this game a bit more difficult to fully recommend is its price. You see, Capes is a relatively small, at least for a TRPG title, that clearly has some janky animations and things that again can be attributed to the developer's relatively small size. But nonetheless, the asking price for Capes is around $40 US, which is a bit on the expensive side as far as TRPGs go, and I would have felt much more comfortable recommending it if it was around the $25-$30 range, which to my mind would be a little more in line with the content you're getting here. But by and large, I mostly enjoyed my time with the title, and I'm willing to recommend it with the caveat that if it sounds like anything that I mentioned here might be something that bothers you more than it did me, maybe simply give the developers some time to work on some of those issues which they've already announced plans to do. At the time of this review, they've already announced a few patches aimed at increasing player freedom in the early game, for instance, as well as additional adjustments to difficulty to be made, so it is potentially possible that some of my issues with this game might be cleared up, which would make it a bit easier to recommend in the face of its asking price. So while I'm currently willing to give it a buy because of how much I enjoyed the later parts of the game and how the progression and everything unfolded, if it sounds like some of the negatives I outlined here would bother you more than they did me, I would simply wait until they knocked like $10 off of it, at which point I think it would be a better proposition overall. But in either case, I do feel like there's an enjoyable experience there to be had, which is pretty much what I have to say about Capes. So that is where we're going to wrap up this particular review, so I certainly hope you enjoyed it, found it informative, but do let me know what you think of this title down in the comment sections below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.